Etienne du Bois, worth 3 billion euros, stood in the pouring Parisian rain wearing borrowed work clothes and calloused hands, waiting to meet the woman who would either love him for who he pretended to be, or shatter every assumption he'd ever made about love and money. The morning mist rolled off the Seine like whispered secrets, shrouding Paris in the kind of romantic ambience that made tourists swoon and locals hurry past with practiced indifference. But for Etienne du Bois, CEO of Du Bois Industries and heir to one of France's oldest fortunes, the fog felt more like a shroud, hiding him from a world that had never seen him as anything more than a bank account with a heartbeat. At 34, he commanded boardrooms across Europe, owned chateaux in 3 countries, and had his photograph regularly featured in magazines like Paris Match and Le Figaro. Yet as he stood in the cramped bathroom of his assistant's Belleville apartment, staring at his reflection, he barely recognized himself. Gone were the hand-tailored Savile Row suits, replaced by paint-stained work clothes borrowed from Henri, his driver's son. His usually immaculate hands were now deliberately roughened with sandpaper and stained with motor oil. The expensive haircut had been replaced by something he'd done himself with kitchen scissors, uneven, authentic, the kind that came from necessity rather than choice. "You look like a fool, mon ami," Henri said from the doorway, shaking his grey head. At 67, Henri had been driving for the Du Bois family since Etienne was in university. More than an employee, he'd become the closest thing to a father figure Etienne had known since his parents died in that airplane crash 15 years ago. "Perhaps," Etienne replied, practicing dropping his refined Parisian accent for something rougher, more working class. "But a necessary fool. Do you know what my last 3 relationships had in common, Henri? They all asked about your net worth before your middle name." Exactment. Etienne turned from the mirror, his transformation complete. Where once stood one of Europe's most eligible bachelors now stood someone who could blend into any construction site or factory floor. "Camille asked me to buy her a boutique in Saint-Germain-des-Prés after our second date. Margot wanted me to invest in her art gallery, which turned out to be a front for money laundering. And Isabelle." He paused, the memory still stinging. Isabelle was already planning our wedding while texting her real boyfriend about how much money she'd get in a divorce settlement. Henri's weathered face softened with understanding. "So now you go to meet this Amélie as, who exactly?" "Etienne Moreau, construction worker from the 15th arrondissement. I do renovations for old buildings, live in a studio apartment, take the metro everywhere." He'd spent weeks perfecting this identity, even going so far as to get temporary work with a construction crew to learn the trade. The blisters on his hands were real, earned through honest labor for the first time in his privileged life. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Du Bois fortune had been built on construction. His great-grandfather had rebuilt half of Paris after the war. But while Etienne knew the business from boardroom presentations and quarterly reports, he'd never actually held a hammer until 3 weeks ago. Have you ever wondered if people would love you if they knew nothing about your status or success? What would you risk to find out? Share your thoughts below. His phone buzzed with a message from his secretary, Marie-Claire. "The board meeting has been moved to tomorrow." Also, that journalist from Le Monde called again about the feature story. "Should I schedule?" Etienne powered off the phone without responding. For the next few hours, he wasn't the billionaire whose decisions affected thousands of employees across France. He wasn't the man whose charitable foundation had donated 50 million euros to rebuild Notre Dame. He was just Etienne, a regular man hoping to meet someone who might see past the surface to whatever lay beneath. The blind date had been arranged by his friend Marc, the only person in his circle who didn't know about his wealth. They'd met during Etienne's brief stint working construction, and Marc had insisted on setting him up with his sister-in-law's best friend. "She's perfect for you," Marc had insisted over beers in a working-class bistro in Ménilmontant. "Amélie works at the Children's Hospital, pediatric nurse, heart of gold, doesn't care about money. She broke up with her last boyfriend because he was too obsessed with status symbols." Now, walking through the narrow streets of Montmartre toward their meeting spot, a modest café near Sacré-Cœur, Etienne felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine nervousness. Not the calculated anxiety of a corporate takeover or the performance nerves of addressing shareholders, but the raw, vulnerable flutter of a man who had no idea if he was about to make a fool of himself. The Café des Deux Moulins bustled with typical Parisian energy, tourists snapping photos, locals reading Liberation over Café au Lait, the eternal dance of a city that had perfected the art of casual sophistication. Etienne had chosen a table near the back, positioned so he could observe without being immediately noticed. And then he saw her. Amélie Rousseau entered like sunlight breaking through clouds, her auburn hair catching the soft afternoon glow filtering through the cafe's windows. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her eyes, and carried herself with a kind of graceful confidence that had nothing to do with designer labels or expensive accessories. When she smiled at the waiter who greeted her, the entire room seemed to brighten. At 29, she possessed something that all of Etienne's wealth couldn't buy, an authenticity that radiated from within. She looked around the cafe with curious, intelligent eyes, clearly searching for her blind date, and when her gaze briefly met his, he felt his carefully rehearsed introduction evaporate like morning mist. This wasn't going to be a test anymore. Sitting in that crowded Montmartre cafe, watching a woman who had no idea she was about to meet one of France's wealthiest men, N. Du Bois realized that his masquerade had already begun to change him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Etienne's hands trembled slightly as he stood up, his carefully rehearsed introduction dissolving under the weight of Amélie's genuine smile. She approached his table with a kind of natural grace that expensive finishing schools tried and failed to teach, her eyes sparkling with curiosity rather than the calculated interest he'd grown accustomed to from women in his usual social circle. "And?" she asked, her voice carrying the warm melody of someone who spent her days comforting children. "I'm Amélie. Marc described you perfectly. Tall, dark hair, and—" She paused, studying his face with those remarkable blue eyes. "He said you'd look nervous, but I think he undersold that part." Despite himself, Etienne laughed, a real laugh, not the polished chuckle he used in board meetings. Was I that obvious? I was hoping to project rugged confidence. Rugged? Yes. Confident. She tilted her head, considering. Let's say charmingly uncertain. It's refreshing, actually. Most men I meet act like they've already won a prize just by showing up. As they settled into their seats, Etienne found himself studying her with an intensity that had nothing to do with his original plan. Every gesture was unconsciously elegant, the way she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, how she thanked the waiter in accented English when he brought her café crème, the genuine interest in her expression as she leaned forward slightly to better hear him speak. "So, Marc tells me you're in construction," Amélie said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. Her fingers were long and graceful, but he noticed small calluses from years of medical work, honest marks from honest labor, just like the ones he deliberately created on his own hands. "Renovations, mostly," Etienne replied, grateful for the weeks of preparation that made the life flow naturally. "Old buildings. Historical preservation. There's something satisfying about bringing new life to structures that have seen decades of stories." Her face lit up with unexpected enthusiasm. "That's beautiful. I work with children, pediatric nursing at Hôpital Necker, and I always tell them that healing is like renovation. You're not changing what's fundamentally there, just helping it become strong again." The comparison hit him like a physical blow. Here was a woman who spent her days literally healing people, while he spent his manipulating markets and maximizing shareholder value. The contrast made his chest tighten with something that felt dangerously like shame. "That must be incredibly rewarding work," he managed, meaning every word. "And difficult." "Some days." A shadow passed across her features, quickly replaced by that radiant warmth. "Yesterday I had to explain to a 6-year-old why his parents couldn't afford the surgery he needs. The public system has waiting lists, and private care." She shrugged expressively. "Well, you know how expensive healthcare can be." Etienne's jaw clenched involuntarily. He knew exactly how expensive healthcare could be. His charitable foundation had donated millions to children's hospitals across France. The thought that this woman, this angel, was dealing with financial barriers to care when he could write a check to solve the problem instantly made his deception feel suddenly monstrous. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been heartbreaking." It was. But it's also why I do this work. Every child deserves a chance, regardless of their family's bank account. She looked directly at him then, and the passion in her voice made something fundamental shift in his chest. "Money can't buy love or happiness, but it can buy life. I just wish it were distributed more fairly, you know." What would you do if you met someone whose values challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself? Have you ever felt an instant connection with someone that terrified and thrilled you? Let us know in the comments. Welcome back, my incredible viewers. Your comments from the last video have been absolutely overwhelming. I can see how deeply you're all connecting with the story, and the theories you've been sharing are absolutely brilliant. Some of you are surprisingly close to the truth of what's coming next. But before we continue, don't forget to smash that like button if you're enjoying what you're seeing. Your support means the world to me and helps this channel grow. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our uploads. We're building an amazing community here, and I don't want you to miss out on what's coming. And please, share this video with your friends, family, or anyone who would love this type of content. The more people we can bring into this community, the better it gets for everyone. Your engagement in the comments has been incredible, and I love reading every single one of your thoughts and theories. Keep them coming. Now, let's go in depth into the story. The irony was crushing. She was talking to someone who had more money than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes. Someone who could solve her patient's problems with a single phone call, and he was sitting there pretending to be a struggling construction worker. "What about you?" she asked, steering the conversation away from the heaviness. "What made you choose construction?" "It's honest work, I respect that." Honest work. The phrase hit him like a slap. My family has always worked with their hands," he said, which was technically true if you counted signing acquisition papers and corporate deals. "There's something pure about creating something tangible, something that will outlast you." As they talked, the afternoon melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Amélie told him about her childhood in Lyon, her dreams of opening a free clinic someday, her love of old films and weekend walks along the Seine. Etienne found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone. Not the carefully edited versions he used at charity galas, but real memories. He told her about learning to read in his grandmother's library, about the loneliness of growing up in chateaux where servants outnumbered family members, about the weight of expectations he'd carried since childhood. Of course, he edited out the wealth, the privilege, the €1 billion inheritance. But beneath those omissions, everything he shared was startlingly true. "You have sad eyes," Amélie said suddenly, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. The contact sent electricity up his arm. Like someone who's lost more than most people your age should have lost. The observation was so accurate it took his breath away. "My parents died when I was 19, he admitted. "Plane crash. I suppose I'm still figuring out how to navigate the world without them." Her expression softened with genuine compassion. "I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating." "It changed everything," he said honestly. It had thrust him into control of a business empire when he should have been finishing university, surrounded him with advisors and board members when what he'd needed was family. "Loss has a way of teaching us what matters," Amélie said quietly. "When my grandmother died last year, I realized how much time I'd wasted worrying about impressing people who didn't really know me. Now I try to live more authentically, to connect with people who see me for who I am, not what I can do for them." Her words hit him like a physical blow. She was describing exactly what he was pretending to want, while he sat there deceiving her in the most fundamental way possible. As the sun began to set over Montmartre, painting the cafe windows in shades of gold and amber, Etienne realized that his carefully planned test had become something else entirely. He wasn't evaluating Amélie anymore, he was falling for her, completely and irrevocably. The problem was, the man she was falling for didn't exist. 3 weeks had passed since that first meeting at Café des Deux Moulins, and Etienne found himself living a double life that was slowly tearing him apart. By day, he was still the CEO of Dubois Industries, making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. But every evening, he transformed into Etienne Moreau, construction worker, modest dreamer, and the man who was desperately, hopelessly in love with Amélie Rousseau. The small studio apartment he'd rented in the 15th arrondissement had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He'd furnished it with second-hand pieces from the Marches auxiliary puces, learned to cook simple meals on the two-burner stove, and practiced the art of living within an imaginary construction worker's budget. The irony wasn't lost on him that this cramped space, smaller than his master bathroom at the chateau, felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years. Tonight, as he waited for Amélie outside the Metro Bierhackheim station, Etienne's hands shook as he checked his appearance in his phone's camera. Gone was the Rolex Submariner, replaced by a Casio he'd bought at a pharmacy. His clothing bore authentic paint stains from his continued work with Mark's crew, work he'd initially undertaken as research but now found genuinely satisfying. "Bonsoir, handsome," Amélie's voice made him turn, and as always, the sight of her stopped his breath. She wore a simple yellow sundress that made her eyes look like sapphires, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that suggested she'd just finished a long shift at the hospital. "How was work?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the Champ de Mars. It had become their ritual, evening strolls through different neighborhoods, discovering Paris together as if neither of them had lived there their entire lives. Challenging, she said, linking her arm through his. The casual intimacy of the gesture still sent electricity through his entire body. Remember little Thomas, the boy I told you about? The one who needs the surgery. Etienne's jaw tightened. He remembered perfectly, 6 years old, heart defect, parents who worked 3 jobs between them but still couldn't afford the private surgery that could save months of waiting. How is he? His condition worsened today. The public waiting list moved him up, but... She stopped walking suddenly, turning to face him with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Etienne, he might not have enough time. And his parents, they're discussing taking loans they'll never be able to repay, mortgaging their entire future for the slim hope that... She broke off, pressing her palms against her eyes. Without thinking, Anne pulled her against his chest, holding her as she fought back tears of frustration and helplessness. Over her head, he stared at the illuminated Eiffel Tower in the distance, knowing that he could solve Thomas's problem with a single phone call. One conversation with his assistant, one transfer from his personal accounts, and that little boy would have the surgery tomorrow. But he couldn't. Not without destroying everything he'd built with Amélie. I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest. I don't usually fall apart like this. It's just, some days the unfairness of it all feels overwhelming. Don't apologize, Etienne said, his voice rough with emotion. Your compassion is one of the things he stopped himself before saying love, though the word hung in the air between them like an unspoken promise. She pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. One of the things you what? The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibilities. They'd been dancing around deeper feelings for weeks, sharing increasingly intimate conversations, growing closer with each shared meal and evening walk. But neither had been brave enough to voice what was becoming increasingly obvious. One of the things that makes you extraordinary, he finished quietly, which was true but not the whole truth. A small smile tugged at her lips. You have a way of making even my worst days bearable. You know that. They resumed walking, but the conversation had shifted something fundamental. The air between them felt charged with unspoken questions and growing intimacy. N, she said as they found a bench overlooking the Seine, can I ask you something personal? His stomach clenched. Of course. Sometimes when you talk, you sound different. More educated than most construction workers I've met. And your hands, she took one of his hands in both of hers, studying the calluses he'd so carefully cultivated. These look recent. Like you haven't been doing manual labor your whole life. The observation was so accurate it felt like a physical blow. I read a lot, he managed. Always have. And the hand thing, I used to work in an office, doing administrative stuff for construction companies. Only recently started doing actual building work. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it felt like one. Every half-truth was another brick in a wall that was growing between them, even as their emotional connection deepened. That makes sense, she said, but he caught a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite suspicion, but curiosity. I feel like there's more to your story than you're telling me. Isn't that true for everyone? He deflected, hating himself for it. She studied his face in the lamplight, and he had the terrifying sense that she could see right through his carefully constructed facade. Yes, she said finally. I suppose it is. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the bateaux mouches drift past on the Seine, their lights creating ribbons of gold on the dark water, and was acutely aware of Amélie's warmth beside him, the way her shoulder pressed against his, the subtle scent of her perfume mixing with the evening air. I need to tell you something, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. His heart stopped. Had she figured it out? Had someone recognized him despite his careful disguise? What is it? She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. I'm falling in love with you. The words hit him like a physical force, wonderful and terrible at the same time. Everything he'd wanted to hear, delivered at the moment when he felt least deserving of them. Amélie. I know it's fast, she rushed on, and maybe it's crazy, but I've never felt this way about anyone before. You make me feel seen, understood in a way that, she paused, studying his expression. You look terrified. Did I just ruin everything? No, he said quickly, reaching for her hands. No, you didn't ruin anything. God, Amélie, I'm falling in love with you too. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her since they met, and also the most complicated. She smiled then, radiant and beautiful, and leaned forward to kiss him. It was their first real kiss, soft, tentative, then deeper as months of growing attraction finally found expression. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I was so afraid you didn't feel the same way," she whispered against his lips. "I do," he said, and it was true. "I feel exactly the same way." But even as he said it, even as he held her close and felt her heart beating against his chest, he knew that he was living on borrowed time. The foundation of their relationship was built on deception, and no matter how genuine his feelings had become, the truth would eventually surface. Have you ever been caught between a lie that spiraled beyond your control and feelings too real to deny? What would you choose? Love built on deception or the risk of losing everything by telling the truth? Share your thoughts below. The question that haunted him as they walked back toward the metro, fingers intertwined, was whether love this pure could survive the revelation of who he really was. And whether he was brave enough to find out. As they said goodnight at her apartment building in the 11th arrondissement, Amélie kissing him softly before disappearing through the heavy wooden door, and realized that his elaborate test had become the most authentic relationship of his life. And also, potentially, the most destructive. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, shattering Etienne's carefully constructed world like glass against stone. "Monsieur Dubois," his assistant Marie-Claire's voice was strained through the phone speaker. "I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been an emergency. The Marseille project, the entire scaffolding collapsed. 7 workers are in critical condition, and the media is already calling for your response. The board is demanding an emergency meeting in 2 hours." Etienne sat up in his cramped studio apartment, his mind racing between 2 worlds that were about to collide catastrophically. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's baby crying, the sound of real life continuing around him while his parallel existence crumbled. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, already mentally switching from Etienne Moreau back to Etienne Dubois, a transformation that felt like shedding his skin. But as he reached for his phone to cancel his evening plans with Amélie, another call interrupted. The display showed her number, and his heart clenched with dread. "Etienne." Her voice was thick with tears. "I'm at the hospital. It's Thomas. He collapsed an hour ago. They're doing emergency surgery, but..." Her voice broke completely. The irony was crushing. While he'd been fielding calls about corporate crises that would be resolved with insurance payouts and legal settlements, the woman he loved was watching a child die, a child he could have saved weeks ago with pocket change from his perspective, but who now might be beyond any help. "I'm coming," he said without thinking. "No, you don't understand. He's in private surgery now. They moved him to the emergency list, but the costs..." She took a shuddering breath. His parents just signed papers that will bankrupt them for the rest of their lives. And if the surgery doesn't work? Etienne closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. In the background, he could hear Marie-Claire still talking urgently about the Marseille situation, about shareholders and liability and damage control. But all he could focus on was Amélie's pain he had the power to end but had chosen not to, for the sake of a deception that now felt monstrous. "Which hospital?" he asked. "Hôpital Necker, but Etienne, visiting hours. I'll find a way in." He hung up and stared at his reflection in the apartment's small mirror. For the first time in weeks, he saw himself clearly, a billionaire who'd been playing dress-up while real people suffered, who'd prioritized his own emotional needs over the lives he could have saved. The decision came with startling clarity. An hour later, Etienne strode through the corridors of Hôpital Necker, but not as the construction worker Amélie expected. He wore one of his tailored suits, his hair perfectly styled, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. Behind him walked Dr. Beaumont, the best pediatric surgeon in France, whom he'd helicoptered in from Lyon 20 minutes earlier. He found Amélie in the family waiting room, still in her yellow dress from their planned dinner, now wrinkled and tear-stained. When she looked up and saw him, the confusion in her eyes was immediate and devastating. "Etienne." She stood slowly, taking in his appearance with growing bewilderment. "What? Why are you dressed like that? How did you get into the hospital at this hour?" Before he could answer, Dr. Beaumont stepped forward. "Excuse me, are you the family of Thomas Girard?" "I'm his nurse," Amélie said, still staring at Etienne with dawning comprehension. "But who are you? How do you know Thomas?" "I'm Dr. Beaumont from Lyon. I've been asked to consult on his case immediately." He turned to Etienne with the deference that came from understanding exactly who was paying his substantial emergency fee. "Monsieur Dubois, Should I proceed with the evaluation? The name hit Amélie like a physical blow. Her face went white as every piece clicked into place. His educated speech, his recent calluses, his mysterious past, the way he seemed to know things a construction worker wouldn't know. Du Bois, she whispered, backing away from him. As in Du Bois Industries. As in. She pressed her hand to her mouth, understanding flooding her features with something that looked like betrayal and disgust. Oh my God. You're him. You're the Etienne Du Bois. Amélie, let me explain. Explain. Her voice rose, attracting stares from other families in the waiting room. Explain what? That you've been lying to me for weeks? That you've been playing some sick game while She stopped, her professional training warring with her personal devastation. Thomas. You did this for Thomas. It wasn't a question. She was too intelligent, too perceptive not to understand the timing. He needed help, Etienne said simply. You were suffering, watching him suffer, and I could help. By lying to me? By making me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. Tears streamed down her face now, but her voice was steady with the kind of cold fury that comes from deep betrayal. Do you have any idea what you've done? Dr. Beaumont cleared his throat uncomfortably. Excusez-moi, but the patient's condition is quite serious. Should I proceed with the consultation? Yes, Etienne said immediately. Do whatever needs to be done. Cost is no object. Cost is no object, Amélie repeated bitterly. How easy that must be for you to say. How easy everything must be when you're worth more than most countries' GDP. It's not about the money. Everything is about the money, she exploded, her professional composure finally cracking completely. Your whole elaborate charade was about the money. You wanted to test whether I was a gold digger, so you decided to play dress-up and slum it with the working class. Did it amuse you, watching me worry about rent and groceries while you could have bought the entire arrondissement? Each word was like a knife to his chest, made worse because every accusation was partially true. At first, yes, he admitted, the honesty ripping from his throat like broken glass. But it stopped being about that the moment I met you. Everything I felt, everything we shared, was built on lies. She wiped her tears angrily. Every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every time I opened my heart to you, it was based on a fundamental deception about who you are. The feelings weren't a deception, Etienne said desperately. Everything I told you about my loneliness, my loss, my dreams, that was all real. Your dreams. She laughed bitterly. What dreams could you possibly have unfulfilled? You own half of France. The dream of being loved for who I am, not what I have, he said quietly. The dream of finding someone who sees past the money to whatever might be worth loving underneath. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. Then Dr. Beaumont returned, his expression grave. The surgery can proceed, he announced, but we need to move immediately. The family will need to sign additional consent forms. As Thomas's parents approached with tear-stained faces, Amélie turned back to Etienne. Why now? Why reveal yourself now? Because, Etienne said, meeting her eyes with all the honesty he should have given her from the beginning, saving that little boy matters more than protecting my secrets. And because you deserve to know who you're really dealing with, even if it means losing you forever. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Du Bois Foundation's new headquarters in the 7th arrondissement, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. And stood in his office, no longer hiding behind borrowed work clothes or false identities, but he felt more exposed than he ever had during his months as Etienne Moreau. The foundation had become his full-time focus since that devastating night at Hôpital Necker. He'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Du Bois Industries, appointing a managing director while he threw himself into philanthropy with the intensity of a man trying to atone for months of deception. The children's wing at Necker had been completely renovated and expanded. Thomas Girard had not only survived his surgery but had become the foundation's unofficial mascot, his bright smile appearing in every annual report. But success in saving lives hadn't filled the aching void that Amélie's absence had left in his chest. Monsieur Du Bois. His new assistant, Pierre, appeared in the doorway with a stack of grant applications. The afternoon meeting with the Ministry of Health is confirmed, and the reporter from Le Figaro is here early for the interview about the foundation's first anniversary. Nodded, straightening his tie, a gesture that had become unconscious over the months as he'd learned to live authentically as himself, without disguises or pretense. The irony wasn't lost on him that removing his elaborate deception had forced him to become more genuine than he'd ever been as a billionaire. "Send her in," he said, then paused. "Actually, what's her name again?" "Amélie Rousseau," Pierre said with professional neutrality that didn't hide his knowing look. "She's freelancing for several publications now, apparently. Quite accomplished. She's the one who broke the story about healthcare inequality that led to the new government initiatives." Etienne's heart stopped. 6 months of careful avoidance, of deliberately attending different charity events, of ensuring their paths never crossed, and now she was walking into his office as a journalist. When she appeared in the doorway, the sight of her hit him like a physical blow. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself with the professional confidence of someone who'd found new purpose, but her eyes, those remarkable blue eyes, were guarded in a way they'd never been during their time together. "Monsieur Dubois," she said formally, extending her hand for a business handshake. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview." The touch of her fingers, even briefly and professionally, sent familiar electricity up his arm. "Ms. Rousseau, please, have a seat." She settled across from his desk, pulling out a digital recorder and notepad with practiced efficiency. For several moments, they sat in silence, 6 months of unspoken words hanging between them like a bridge neither was willing to cross. "So," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "the Dubois Foundation has donated over 200 million euros in its first year. That's an unprecedented amount for a new charitable organization. What motivated this dramatic pivot from corporate focus to philanthropy?" The question was professional, but he heard the subtext. Why now? Why this sudden need to prove yourself? "Sometimes," Etienne said carefully, "it takes losing something precious to understand what really matters. The foundation exists because I learned that wealth without purpose is just elaborate emptiness." Something flickered in her eyes, not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition of genuine change. "The Children's Healthcare Initiative specifically," she continued, "seems to be your primary focus. Was there a particular case that inspired this direction?" "There was a little boy," Etienne said, his voice softening despite his attempt at professional distance. "Thomas Girard. 6 years old. Needed surgery his family couldn't afford. His case made me realize that having the power to help and choosing not to use it is a form of moral cowardice." Amélie's hand stilled on her notepad. "You saved Thomas." "We saved Thomas. The foundation, the hospital, his doctors." "You saved him," she repeated quietly, looking directly at him for the first time since entering the office. "That night, when you revealed who you weren't thinking about damage control or public image. You saved him." The admission hung in the air between them, the first acknowledgement of their shared history since that devastating confrontation. "It was the right thing to do," Etienne said simply. "I should have done it weeks earlier." "Why didn't you?" The question was no longer professional journalism. It was personal, direct, the kind of question that demanded absolute honesty. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "Because I was so terrified of losing what we had that I was willing to let a child suffer to protect my secret. Because I'd convinced myself that my feelings justified my deception." Amélie set down her pen, her professional facade finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what it felt like? Discovering that everything I thought I knew about you was a lie. Probably similar to what it felt like for you to discover that I'd been lying to you for months," Etienne said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Amélie. I know I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that my feelings for you were never a deception. Everything else was false, but that was real." She studied his face with the same perceptive intelligence that had first drawn him to her. "I know," she said finally. "I hated that I knew. It would have been easier if your feelings had been fake too. What would you do if someone you loved had lied about everything, but their feelings for you were genuine? Can real love grow from false foundations? We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments." "I heard about your career change," Etienne said, desperate to shift away from the minefield of their personal history. "Investigative journalism. You're exposing the same inequalities you used to see firsthand as a nurse." A small smile tugged at her lips, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "It turns out being deceived by a billionaire gives you excellent insight into how power can manipulate truth. I've become quite good at detecting when people aren't being honest about their motivations." "I imagine you have." They sat in silence for a moment, both acknowledging the elephant in the room, the fact that her new career had been born, at least partially, from the betrayal he'd caused. "The foundation," she said finally, returning to safer professional ground, "it's not just charity work, is it? You're trying to build something sustainable, something that addresses systemic problems rather than just treating symptoms." "I had a very good teacher about the difference between treating symptoms and addressing root causes," he said, meeting her eyes. "A pediatric nurse who taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about creating conditions where things can grow stronger." This time, her smile was fuller, more genuine. "That's a good quote for your article. Will you use it?" "Maybe." She gathered her things, the interview clearly concluding. "Thank you for your time, Monsieur Dubois. This was illuminating." As she stood to leave, and found himself standing as well, his heart racing with the possibility that this might be his only chance. "Amélie," he said, her name a question and a plea. She paused at the door, not turning around. "Yes. I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider having dinner with me? Not as an interview, not as part of any agenda. Just dinner. Between two people who once knew each other very well." For a long moment, she didn't respond. When she finally turned around, her expression was unreadable. "I'll think about it," she said, and walked out of his office, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the first genuine hope he'd felt in 6 months. 3 days later, she called. 2 weeks after that, they met at a small bistro in Montmartre, not far from where they'd had their first coffee, but different enough to feel like new ground. She arrived as herself, he arrived as himself, and for the first time in their relationship, neither was pretending to be someone else. The conversation was tentative at first, filled with the careful politeness of people learning to trust again. But gradually, as the evening wore on, they began to rediscover the connection that had drawn them together in the first place, only now it was built on truth rather than deception. "I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago," Etienne said as they walked along the Seine after dinner, the lights of Paris reflecting in the dark water. "Neither am I," Amélie replied. "The question is whether these new versions of ourselves can build something real together." "I'd like to try," he said quietly. "If you'll let me." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "It won't be easy. Trust, once broken, doesn't just magically repair itself. And I won't pretend your wealth doesn't exist or that it doesn't complicate things. I know. But," she continued, and his heart lifted at the word, "I also know that the man who revealed himself to save a child, knowing it would cost him everything he wanted, might be worth getting to know honestly." When she kissed him then, softly and tentatively, it felt like a new beginning, not a return to what they'd had before, but a first step toward something that could be built on truth. The billionaire who'd thought he needed to pretend to be poor to find love had discovered something far more valuable. That authentic connection requires the courage to be completely, vulnerably yourself, and that sometimes the greatest wealth is the love of someone who sees all your flaws and chooses to stay anyway. 6 months later, at the Foundation's second annual gala, Amélie stood beside him as he announced the opening of 5 new children's hospitals across France. She wasn't there as his hidden girlfriend or his elaborate test subject, but as his partner, a woman who'd chosen to love a man not despite his wealth, but despite his capacity for deception, and who was helping him build a legacy worth more than any business empire. In the audience, Thomas Girard sat with his parents, healthy and laughing, living proof that sometimes the most important truths can only be revealed when we stop pretending to be someone else. The masquerade was finally over. The real love story had just begun. I'm glad you joined us on Etienne's journey from deception to authenticity, from testing love to earning it. This story reminds us that while love may begin with attraction or chemistry, it can only grow with truth and vulnerability. Have you ever had to choose between protecting a comfortable lie and risking everything for honesty? What does authentic love mean to you? Share your thoughts. We believe every love story teaches us something about courage, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Thanks for watching till the end. We know you loved this story, and there are many more thrilling ones waiting for you. Just click on the video on your screen to dive into the next chapter.